Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to the B350 VRM crash course video because I made a mistake in that video. I significantly overestimated the cooling capabilities of the VRM heatsinks on pretty much every single B350 motherboard out there. So, we're gonna use the B350 Plus here for just sort of demonstrating some airflow thought processing kind of stuff. I don't really know what I'm doing with this video. I don't know what I'm doing at the best of times, so here goes. But yeah, we're going to be using this B350 Prime Plus board. This I actually used for benchmarking a GTX 1070 on liquid nitrogen, which was really cool. Which is why the board looks like this. So there's plasti dip all over here, and then this is just sort of an indicator that this was the board I used on that stream. It ran 4 gigahertz, and as well as 3200 CL12 on the memory at, I think, 1.5 volts for the memory. So, it's it's a pretty... I was impressed by the capabilities of this board for the price. Because ultimately those were short-term benchmark runs, so VRMs didn't really get that hot. And I have a habit of just throwing, fans on top of things like memory or the VRM, or just it's just, I have a ton of loose fans around the place, so it's just, well, there's an empty fan connector, bam. I'll often just plug in the CPU fan header to not get the stupid error message and leave the CPU fan sitting on the memory sticks or the VRM just to keep it cool. So I never ran into any issues running this board during that time. And recently somebody notified me that a lot of these B350 boards are actually hitting really high VRM temperatures. So I did a little bit of testing, and I ran this board on the the open bench table that I use, so that thing. So yeah, I put the board on there, actually use the same layout as it currently has, so, AIO over here, all the way over there, and then board just sitting here, no fans on the board itself. And what ended up happening when running Intel burn test with the Ryzen 7 1700 at 3.85 gigahertz, 1.4 volts at the CPU socket, it was about 1.5 at the VRM, so there's a huge amount of voltage loss going on between the VRM and the CPU socket. They really should have put more copper in this PCB. But, yeah, so 1.4 volts at the CPU socket, 3.85 gigahertz. I never actually ran Intel burn test on the CPU, so I'm kind of surprised that a CPU that does 4 gigahertz Cinebench can only do 3.85 Intel burn test, but it is what it is. So yeah, 3.85 Intel burn test, 1.4 volts at the socket, which is actually 1.387 in the BIOS with Extreme LLC. That's how you get that 1.4 volts at the socket. With those settings, after, I think, a few hours, I don't remember how long I was running the tests for. I basically ran them until the temperature of the VRM just stopped rising. And that happened at around 117 degrees centigrade on the CPU V-Core VRM heatsink. So this thing got really hot. Especially considering that, it was in an open air environment, 25 degrees centigrade. Admittedly, no active airflow, but 25 degrees ambient. So, yeah. And 117 is like, the MOSFETs will be fine at 117 degrees centigrade. The concerning thing is capacitors. These, for example, on this board are 5,000 hours at 105 degrees. Most motherboards rate for either, most lower end boards will be 5,000 hours. If you go really garbage grade motherboards, you'll get 2,500 hours rated. So 5,000 hours rated capacitors last about 208 days at 105 degrees. That's just to give you an idea of some kind of real time unit, because 5,000 hours doesn't say anything to anyone. It's too big. But 208 days, that's not even a year at full load, and these capacitors would start failing outright. So then you obviously get some of the higher end boards with 10K and 12K rated capacitors. But again, this is at only 105 degrees. The VRM was at 117. So in a no airflow environment, yeah, the VRM gets really hot, and that made me realize, it might be worth pointing out to people that they might, if you're aiming for 4 gigahertz on a B350 motherboard with these VRMs are not particular, like they're not horrifically inefficient. They're not great. They're certainly worse than like any of the good X370 VRMs, and because there are some actually bad X370 VRMs as well. But if you're comparing even a good B350 VRM to a good X370 VRM, there's a significant difference there. And this is really a VRM I don't consider that bad. It's not that inefficient. If we just look at the MOSFET power losses at 100 amps current throughput for the V-core, this is still doing about an 89% efficiency. That's not factoring in inductor power losses, capacitor power losses, power plane power losses, all the other power losses in the system. But the MOSFETs themselves are still pretty efficient. Even on the least efficient of the B350 boards, you're looking at MOSFETs doing about 87% efficiency for 100 amps current output, which is around what you need for a 4 gigahertz 1.4 volt overclock on Ryzen. So, it's not the VRMs are horrifically inefficient. It's a case of these VRMs don't have big enough heat sinks, because 117 degrees in still air, not great. Now, I started experimenting with, introducing some airflow to the VRM. If you just stick a fan right on the VRM, temperatures fall off a cliff immediately. VRM ends up hovering around 80 degrees centigrade. Just putting a fan like about this far away from the VRM already significantly lowered the VRM temperatures from that 117 to into the hundreds range. In fact, just blowing on the VRM, like blowing on the VRM, which was just this sort of spur of the moment, like, I wonder if I could actually blow the VRM into running cool, and yeah, I could. It would be extremely annoying to do, but yeah, it was actually like basically any amount of airflow, just more than the natural heat rises airflow levels, made a significant impact on the VRM temperatures. So basically, if you're in a case environment and you have some airflow going basically front to back over the motherboard, or you have, ideally what you'd really want is something like, say, exhaust fans that are at the same level as the motherboard, because if they're at the same level, they actually pull air straight through the heat sinks, though fans kind of suck at pulling, so you might want to actually have your fans reversed. That would give you better VRM temperatures. It may screw with the rest of your system's thermals, but it would definitely be most beneficial for your VRM, even if everything else ends up complaining. Now, if you're not using a tower cooler or an AIO, you don't need to worry about this so much. If you're using a downdraft air cooler like the stock cooler for Ryzen, the fan blows air straight at the freaking motherboard. That air then goes through the VRM heatsink. I think it might be beneficial to, at that point, also not include the I/O cover, because that air, like, it's, the more holes there are, and as long as there is positive pressure somewhere in this area, it's gonna leak out through where the I/O cover used to be. So you're gonna get some actual, that might actually help cooling performance to leave out the I/O cover for the board, which I'd really love to test. I just don't have any cases to test with. I only have open air test benches, unless you count my personal rig, and I'm not going to tear down my personal rig to test motherboard VRM temperatures. I'm sorry. It's just not worth my time. But, yeah, it might be worth to ignore the I/O cover, but if you are on the stock heat sinks, then your VRM does get cooled by the airflow from the VRM, from the CPU heatsink itself. The other benefit to the stock heatsink is the stock heatsink is just not good enough to cool a Ryzen 8 core at 4 gigahertz 1.4 volts, or even just any clock at 1.4 volts, because really between 3.8, which would be like a trash bin CPU, and 4.1, which would be like a really good chip, the clock speed doesn't make that much of a difference in your power draw as that 1.4 volts does. So if you're at 1.4 volts, your downdraft air cooler, not going to cut it. And so you're not going to really put that much strain on the VRMs, because ultimately the voltage really dictates how much really has more impact on your power consumption than your frequency. So, yeah, you know, if you're on the stock air cooler, you basically get proper VRM airflow, so that keeps the VRM cool, and two, the CPU can't be clocked that high, so the VRM will be cool. So basically you get double cooling by just using a heatsink that kind of sucks. Now, if you actually want to use a good heatsink, you should look into some kind of downdraft air cooler, which I don't know how many currently support AM4, but definitely those heatsinks will give you the best VRM temperatures without, you know, fabric cobbling various modification. Like, basically, if you're on an AIO, what you're going to want to do is zip tie a fan to the mounting bracket of the AIO that will hold in place over the VRM. And that'll actually give you the best temperatures. Actually, it should get you better temperatures than the downdraft air coolers at that point. It's just not going to look very nice. And it'll need a little bit more creativity and work than just, you know, mounting the heatsink the way it's meant to be mounted. If you're on a tower cooler, ignoring the fact that this is currently configured as push, let's just say it was like that. My recommendation would be to, on tower coolers, my recommendation would be to try get the push fan on this as low as possible. Because if the fan is lower down the heatsink, it'll force air through the sort of the hole down here, and then more of the air will actually end up, you'll have more direct airflow directly over the VRM, and that'll again help VRM thermals. Whereas if the fan is high up the heatsink, you know, if the fan is high up the heatsink, the air will be basically sort of skimming across the top of the heatsink, not necessarily doing as much. So yeah, and if you have one of those dual towers, you're kind of screwed. Because honestly, you can't get the fans low enough on those without like completely giving up RAM or something. So yeah, but it is just something to consider with B350 boards. You want to do something about VRM airflow. As long as there is actual air flowing over the VRM, you shouldn't have too massive issues with thermals, unless you're in a very warm climate, at which point I'm just going to recommend that you don't overclock that high, because yeah, it's, well, you could overclock high if you're willing to, you know, invest in like a 60 millimeter fan, or just invest in actually getting some kind of proper cooling onto the B350 motherboard's VRM. However, at that point, I would like to make the counter argument: if you end up spending $10, you know, on well, actually, that's actually really awkward. I don't think there's a $10 motherboard upgrade that would get you that much of an improvement in VRM quality. At least not on B350. Now that I think about it. So yeah, if you're on B350, you're probably going to be zip tying fans to the motherboard. So just kind of deal with it, because, well, you get what you pay for, and you don't get much when you don't pay much. So yeah. But you're going to want to get basically a bit creative with trying to get some airflow over the heatsinks, or you're going to end up in a situation where the VRM may end up well past the 100 range. And the bigger issue with these B350 boards is a lot of these don't have any thermal protection or any thermal monitoring at all for the VRM, because, as I said earlier, you know, you're paying less money for these motherboards, you get less stuff on them, and some of that missing stuff on some motherboards will be temperature sensors, and this has been going on for ages and ages and ages. On AM3 Plus, there is a ton of cheap motherboards where, you know, they'll let you set as much as 1.5 volts V-core, they'll let you run an 8-core, and they don't have a temperature sensor, and they don't have any kind of overcurrent protection, and they don't have any kind of over-temperature protection, because there's no temperature sensor, so you can't implement a temperature-based VRM shutdown. So you end up with motherboards where, you know, the VRM hits 150 plus degrees very quickly and burns itself to pieces because, well, there's no safeties built into the motherboard because it costs too little. And safeties cost money to implement. So yeah, with a lot of these B350 boards, if you're getting some kind of weird temperature readings in, say, Hardware Info 64, as in the temperature readings just don't change no matter how much strain you put on the CPU or how long it's been idling for, you probably don't have a temperature sensor in the motherboard at all, or if it is there, it's not working properly. So, you know, it's it does make optimizing your motherboard VRM airflow very hard if you don't have any temperature readings. And at that point, again, it's like, well, you could go buy a temperature probe, but that's just making a cheap motherboard more expensive because you're buying equipment to make the motherboard not explode. You know, at that point, you might be like, well, I could have just bought a better motherboard, which is kind of the downfall of a lot of these B350s and a lot of the cheap motherboards. It's like, technically, if you baby them and you compensate for all of their shortcomings, you can make them run 4 gigahertz, and you can make them run high voltages, you know, high strain load scenarios. It's just a matter of you're gonna basically start upgrading the motherboard to make it do that. And I kind of failed to account for the fact that, well, a lot of these boards just don't ship with very good heat sinks out of the box. So yeah, that's kind of a follow-up to the B350 motherboard VRM video. Ultimately, I'm going to say I wouldn't be that concerned if your VRM, like, ultimately it also depends on, like, on your use case. And I do have notes here, I just keep forgetting to check them, so that's why we just did that ultimately twice. But yeah, it really depends on your use case. Like, if you do a lot of video encoding, right, your CPU is going to be pegged at 100% a lot of the time. You're not going to want the VRM hitting 100 degrees, because if that VRM is hitting over 100 degrees for, you know, the better part of a year, bye-bye capacitors. And you're going to be buying a new motherboard. You don't want to be doing that. That is just, yeah. So if you're doing high load and you want to run a heavy overclock, get a better motherboard. If you're doing high load and you can't afford a better motherboard, run a lower overclock. Because otherwise what'll end up happening is, you know, like, you're either going to spend a ton of time trying to figure out how to get enough airflow over the VRM so that it doesn't cook, or you're going to end up in a situation where, like, because ultimately, like, the other issue is you might be you might optimize your airflow, but you're still chucking, you know, say 40 degree, 50 degree air at the VRM. And from my testing when I was, you know, fan literally sitting on VRM, that was 25 degrees ambient. That was still hitting 80 degrees on the VRM. If you were at, say, 50 degrees ambient, that's, what, 25 degrees over what I was using to cool that VRM? Well, now the VRM's almost at that 105 degree range again because of that high ambient temperature, and your capacitors aren't going to last that long again. So, you know, it really depends on your use case. If you're going to be running, you know, long hours of heavy load at high ambient temperatures, you kind of can't make a B350 VRM survive that very long. It just, like, you can't. You're going to need insane amounts of airflow, or you're just going to put more work into making the board not die in, you know, a couple hundred or a few hundred in a few hundred days than it is really worth. But if you're, you know, if you're just gaming or not running the board full out, like if you're not running the CPU full out for hours a day, then it's not really a problem that if you run Prime 95 that the VRM hits 100, because it doesn't spend that much time at 100. So yeah, it kind of, you know, like that's the downside to trying to run really high clocks on cheaper hardware, is it can be done. You just need to be a lot more careful. So yeah, and I kind of, when I was doing that B350 VRM crash course, I kind of forgot that most people don't you know, stick thermal probes in VRMs when they're like, I wonder if this will catch on fire, and that kind of thing. So yeah, kind of sorry for misrepresenting the boards. Can you run 4 gigahertz on them? Yes, under the right conditions. Could you run 4 gigahertz on them for, like, a rendering workstation? No. Nope, definitely not. For a, like, but you could certainly run some of the mild overclocks, like, say, 3.7. You could definitely run all of these boards, I think. 3.7, because at that point you're not even approaching the 1.3 volts range, and the chips are going to be really, really power efficient. So you're not going to be putting anywhere near as much strain on to the V-Core VRM. And at that point, yeah, you might still, if you're in that very high ambient temperature environment, you're still going to need to do something about the airflow. But for everybody else, it's like, they'll be safe under a lot more circumstances. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment down below about if I should actually look into doing some kind of motherboard VRM temperature testing in cases or something. And here's the thing. At the cost of making this video even longer, I really don't consider myself a reviewer, and I really don't like doing work, right? I'm really lazy. So it's like, on one hand, I know exactly what I would want to see in a motherboard, like thermal testing with a case, like proper thermal testing, not just open air test bench and sticking a thermal probe in it. And I have a really good idea of what kind of testing I want to do, like, test run at high airflow, low airflow, and, a variety of overclocks and all kinds of different testing scenarios. But it's like, that takes time and effort, and, well, let's just put it this way. AHOC is not a full-time job, and I don't feel obliged to put that much work into this. So, yeah. I'm not sure. Like, I think it would be cool to do some, in-case testing. On the other hand, I don't really feel like doing it for every single motherboard I get my hands on. And at that point, it's like, is it really worth investing in that much? Like, investing in getting a setup for that. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, leave your thoughts on that down in the comment section below. And if you would like to support what I do here with Actually Hardcore Overclocking, I have a PayPal, a Patreon, and shirts. You can find them all down in the description below. There's a link to all of them. It's one link, and it does all of them. Well, it sends you to a link with, well, the link sends you to more links, but you get the idea. And what was there? What did I miss? Like, share, subscribe, comment. We did that. Patreon, PayPal, all that stuff. We did that. That's it, isn't it? I'm really bad at this YouTube thing, aren't I? Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.